All right, welcome back to Foundations. My name is Dean VanEvery, the associate pastor here at Grand Avenue Baptist Church. So this is lesson 3 of our Old Testament survey series. It's kind of going to be walking through the entire Old Testament, book by book. We'll touch on each book, but not every lesson will have its own book. In the end, it will be 21 lessons. So obviously we'll be doing some squishing things together. This is one of them. We're going to be covering Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy today. I'd originally thought about doing kind of Genesis and then the rest of the Pentateuch, but then Exodus needed its own lesson, so we broke that out and did that by itself. Each of these, man, these are full of really good stuff. But they work in a way that I think that there's a helpful way to look at them together, not as one unit, but kind of as complementary to each other. And so I think just with trying to have economy of time and not letting this whole process run on into too many weeks, we're going to go ahead and kind of squish these together into one lesson. I hopefully we'll be able to tease out some of the high level ideas. That should open up some doors to talk about just how these three books relate to each other and kind of the shape of the Pentateuch as a whole. Pentateuch, that's just Greek for, I think, like five book or something like that. It just means the first 5 books of the Bible. So it's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus here, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That's the first 5, sometimes called the Book of Moses, often referred to just as the Torah. Which is the Hebrew word more or less for law, often used as word, sometimes interchangeable with the whole of the scriptures as a whole. But anyway, so we're going to be tackling Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy today. Again, so this is basically the books of Moses addressed to the Exodus generation and then the desert generation. So this is the people who they themselves and their kids just got brought out of Egypt through the plagues, through the Red Sea, all those things we talked about in the last one. So this is the generation of the people that God has called out of Egypt, and he's called them to Mount Sinai, where he gave them the law, and then he's taken them to the promised land. So the Pentateuch goes from creation in Genesis to Exodus, and then from Exodus out of Egypt, right up to the very edge of the Promised Land, right up to the very edge of Canaan, of Israel, where the story in Deuteronomy ends with basically they're just poised to cross the Jordan River and enter into the Promised Land. And so basically what's happening in these 3 books, in Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, you can kind of think of it basically like God preparing this people to enter the Promised Land. So Exodus, he takes them out of Egypt, and then this basically covers the space of about 40 years. The narrative of these three books. The Lord is taking one generation, ushering them off the stage, and then the next generation preparing them to enter the Promised Land. And so each of these books plays a different role in that. So specifically Leviticus and Numbers. Leviticus is almost entirely. I'm trying to remember if there's any narrative at all. Almost entirely Moses laying out laws, Moses laying out different divine regulations for different aspects of life. And then Numbers is mostly narrative. Numbers covers narrative. Basically, I'll get into the structure more, but covers 2 generations, kind of the generation that got brought out of Egypt, and then the next generation, their children. And it kind of tells those 2 stories in 2 different narrative arcs. And so basically, well, the way you can think of it is that Leviticus is kind of the formal kind of law code preparation to be the people of God. This is God saying, hey, here's the structure of what it's going to look like for you to be the people of God, for you to serve me, to live with me, to be my people. And this is what it's going to look like kind of in a form sense. And then in Numbers, you see a lot kind of more of the emphasis on the substance, a lot more of the faith of the Israelites, a lot more of the fear of the Lord, a lot more of the obedience of the Israelites, where there's these narratives playing out where you see one generation being unfaithful, not having the fear of the Lord, having the fear of man instead, and not being obedient to the Lord, and that generation gets, like I said, ushered off the stage, and the next generation, not perfect, not without their flaws, but an evident leap forward in the fear of the Lord, an evident leap forward in faith, an evident leap forward in obedience. And so Numbers, you kind of see the Lord preparing his people kind of in substance, right? In kind of the subjective side of shaping in them, faith, fear of the Lord, obedience, all those things. And then Leviticus is the formal structure of that. You can think of it like in Numbers, God is heating up the raw material. He's smelting the iron. And then in Leviticus, he's pouring it into the mold. He's pouring this substance into the form, right? So there's the reality, the substance that we see kind of in the narrative of Numbers, and then kind of formal structure gets spelled out more or less in Leviticus. Deuteronomy kind of comes in basically as a capstone to the entire Pentateuch. It's Deuteronomy is just from the Greek meaning second law, or law a second time. Basically because it covers a lot of similar ground as Exodus and Leviticus. If you remember from Exodus, there's a lot of law code in Exodus, and so Deuteronomy kind of recapitulates a lot of that, restates a lot of that. Again, you get the 10 Commandments again. Exodus 20, you get the 10 Commandments. Deuteronomy 5, you get the 10 Commandments. So it's kind of the law a second time. There's also some narrative, there's also some important narrative. You also see some subjective stuff that's really important. So kind of substance of the faith stuff that's really important. This is where you see the greatest commandment. I'll touch on this in a minute. Where the Lord Jesus Christ points back to and says the greatest commandment is that you would love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. And this comes right out of Deuteronomy 6. And then you see this, what's interesting in Deuteronomy is you see this kind of tracing of that theme of loving the Lord with all your heart. Deuteronomy 6 is just love the Lord with all your heart. Then Deuteronomy 10, there's this interesting kind of rebuke from the Lord saying, all right, guys, you're not obeying me because your heart is not right. So what you need to do, here's what you need to do. You need to fix your heart. You need to circumcise your heart so that you can obey me, so that you can love me. Not surprisingly, they don't. They can't. They can't change their own hearts. Their heart is the seat of their will, the seat of their affection, the seat of their volition. They can't change that in and of themselves. And so you get to chapter 30, verse 6, which is one of my all-time favorite verses. Is a sweet promise of what the Lord is going to do for his people kind of after. It's this real interesting arc where he basically prophesies that the people are going to be faithful for a while. There's going to be great prosperity for a while, but then they're going to kind of decay into apostasy. They're going to be judged. They're going to be sent into exile. And then they're going to eventually, the Lord is going to call them back out of exile. And then in that day, what the Lord is going to do is he's going to circumcise their hearts and the heart of their offspring so that they will love the Lord their God with all their heart, with all their souls, that they may live. Right, so there's this promise of one day, after this great and terrible judgment in Babylon, after you return to the land, then I am going to change your heart. I am going to give you the substance, the true substance, so that you can obey. We see this coming in and through the ministry of the Lord Jesus Christ. That's one of the big transitions from the Old Covenant into the New Covenant. Under the Old Covenant, the substance of all the promises is the same, but it's just these unchanged hearts of the vast majority of the people. Some people really are changed. Some people really are born again. Old Testament saints that were saved in the Old Testament were saved in the same means, under the same processes. They had the dwelling of the Holy Spirit in them. Faith comes from God. It's a gift from the Holy Spirit. So it's not a carnal faith. It's a spiritual faith that these Old Testament believers had. So it's not that they weren't there. It's just they were a stark minority. They were a stark minority. The vast majority of God's covenant people were unbelieving, were unregenerate. And the great change with the new covenant is that now the vast majority are. That the vast majority of the covenant people are regenerate, are born again, have been given the new heart through the working of the Spirit of Christ. So that's kind of the high level overview of kind of what's happening in these three books, leading up into this, getting them to the precipice of the Promised Land. All right, Leviticus kind of prepares them formally. Here's the structure. Numbers prepares them kind of subjectively, personally. Here's the substance. And then Deuteronomy kind of packages it all together and kind of puts a nice little bow on it, and ends with the death of Moses, Joshua taking over, and basically, all right, we're ready to go. Let's go ahead and cross this land. Rolls into Joshua, the next book, and you see that story unfold. So really, I just want to make a quick comment. The issues that are addressed, especially in these three books, really are applicable to kind of the American church in our context right now, right? So culturally, our culture at large, American culture at large, for a long time has been basically all form and no substance, right? So it's all kind of all law, all these cultural norms, these cultural expectations, explicit law, implicit law, but it's kind of we kind of hollowed out any substance. Where basically we live in this kind of not just materialistic, but kind of this postmodern truth relativism where there just is no possibility of substance. It's just all naked form, or I guess substanceless form. And a lot of our societal upheaval is basically people are recognizing that's just hollow. You can't build a life in that. You can't build a family in that. You can't have a culture built on nothing that's just kind of wearing masks and costumes. So we're in this kind of empty formalism as a culture broadly. That's kind of the natural generational outflow of kind of a hedonistic, nothing really matters, so do whatever you want, kind of a couple of generations ago, rolls into a now we're saying, well, that's empty too. Well, why would I waste my time doing that? I'm actually gonna try to I want to build something substantial. I want to tear down this empty facade and I try to replace it with something that has some actual substance to it. So you have this kind of upheaval in kind of the American cultural mindset, just of we don't want empty form anymore. We don't want this hollow, empty mask of a culture. We want something with actual substance. And then at the same time, for the last couple of generations, the American church has kind of been all substance and no form. It's been all kind of the inner subjective side and no form structure, no strict structure, no structure of kind of actually seeing what God tells us to do for our kind of lived out lives. One kind of parable of this is kind of what happened with the kind of so-called with the gospel-centered movement, where kind of there was this idea of let's have a retrieval, basically a retrieval of the gospel. Of let's kind of move away from legalism. Let's move away from a strict list of rules of how you can dress and how you can act and what kind of movies you can watch and what kind of stuff you can do. So it started. This gospel-centered movement started as this much needed corrective to some genuine legalism, to some genuine legalistic tendencies in the American church. Kind of over time, as kind of the first generation of leaders either passed, either died or moved on, or even just kind of grew over time. This movement broadened out and kind of diversified and kind of lost its central, I don't know, central core tenets. Became kind of devolved into kind of an antinomian, just refusal to apply God's law to any area of life in concrete terms. Right, so what started as a retrieval of the gospel somehow drifted into a losing of God's law, just kind of letting go of God's law being meaningful in any kind of concrete way. So the kind of the result of that is that we have the substance of the gospel, but having kind of no uniquely Christian form. Individual Christians and Christian culture as a whole just kind of just gets molded by the secular Americanism form around us. It just we're heated up and melted down into this gospel substance, but then the only form available for us is this kind of secular humanistic Americanism. And so that's what you see, where the church still talks a good game about the gospel, but it just kind of can't have an answer to this just pull of a secularizing form of being shaped into the image of secular America. So one one clear example of this, it's one of those things that just like it just smacks you in the face once you start kind of looking at the dates of some of these things. But one kind of clear example is basically the growing tendency to basically hyper spiritualize, strip away the form of the Sabbath. That basically kind of spiritualizing it into it doesn't really matter. Just kind of go to church and you're fine. That just so happens to kind of coincide with the rise in popularity of the NFL, of the National Football League. And so you have this substance of wanting to honor the Lord, wanting to honor the substance of the Sabbath command, yet without any actual biblical form, without any biblical pattern to pour that into. The only form we have is kind of just secular American, what do you do on Sunday afternoons? And so the NFL makes a lot of money. Anyways, yeah, that's just one example. So another kind of more, I don't know, more penetrating example is kind of what happened in the end of the teens, 2016 through 2019, all kind of that era when this like kind of social justice fever just kind of took over American culture broadly. The American church really didn't have strong footing in biblical principles of justice, so we kind of just rolled along with these secular forms of justice, these secular creeds of what justice is supposed to look like. And so we kind of traded biblical principles of justice for what these secular humanist theories of justice were giving us. And we ended up with a lot of injustice, with a lot of partiality. because we didn't have a biblical form to fill with the substance of of gospel living. So, what we need, right, was very similar to what this Israelite generation of the Exodus generation needed, is both form, Leviticus, and substance, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Right, we need both we need to recover and to rebuild this Christian understanding of what it means to actually practically live under Christ's lordship. And that by definition has to go just way beyond what we do on Sunday mornings between 9 a.m. and 11:30 a.m. It has to go way beyond what we do in our small groups, what we do in our Bible studies. So one area that's just kind of screamingly obvious for this is the area of education. It is the area of educating children. So education, just in what it is, just kind of is the impartation of both form and substance. It's the mature in a culture talking to the immature in a culture and saying, this is the substance and this is the form. That's just the definition of what education is, passing on the culture into the next generation. So this is why when a secular humanistic society like ours puts on government schooling, they're not religiously neutral. There's just no such thing. There's no such thing as being kind of worldview, religion neutral. They're training students because of what they are, because of the worldview they hold. They're training students, and not every individual, but just as a system, training students and cultivating their students to live lives committed to secular humanism. That's just baked into what school is. A Catholic school tends to put out Catholic students. A Muslim school tends to put out Muslim students. A secular humanistic school is going to enculturate students into a secular humanistic worldview. That's just how education works. If you aren't answering the big questions about what we are, what is true of the world, how we ought to live, then you're just not educating. You're just not actually doing the task of educating in the first place. But if you do answer those questions, then you answer them out of your worldview. You have nothing else with which to answer them. And that's not a fault. That's not an accusation. That's just doing their job. That's just an inevitable fact of what it means to educate the next generation. And this is why, and this is relevant to Deuteronomy. This is why for Deuteronomy, again, the capstone of the Pentateuch puts such a key emphasis on education of the next generation. Deuteronomy chapter 6, this is where Jesus finds what he calls the greatest commandment, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. What's the context of that? What does he go on? What does Moses go on to elaborate? What does the Lord go on to elaborate through that? Basically, this commandment is the preface. It's kind of the grounding statement to God's instructions to the Israelites for how they are to educate their children, for how they're to pass along both the form and the substance of what it means to be God's covenant people. So substance and form are both needed. And one of the kind of key elements of form that we just need to recover in our day is education, is what it looks like for God's people to educate the next generation of God's people. So this is kind of the main thrust of these three books, basically establishing gospel form and gospel substance for the covenant people. And we should take some lessons from this, right? Being saved by grace through faith doesn't make God's law irrelevant to us. It makes it a delight to us. It doesn't make it irrelevant. It makes it a delight. So as Christians in the modern world, the great task of this generation is recovering and rebuilding gospel form, recovering the great historic Protestant consensus on law and gospel, and learning to apply both the gospel and God's law to every area of life in the modern world. That's not an easy task. That's not a small mountain to climb. This is a hard task for a hard age that calls for hard men to respond with faith and with joy, to gladly do hard things. Ours is not the age to retreat. Ours is not the age to shrink back, to kind of retreat into kind of academic fiddling with ideas and concepts. Ours is the age to take up the call and the standard of King Jesus, to build lives and families and churches for him, for his glory, and for the good of our world around us. Charles Spurgeon, just legendary 19th century Baptist British preacher, ends one of his sermons kind of touching on the idea, basically kind of lamenting kind of lack of bold and energetic and joyful and faithful leaders in his generation for the cause of Christ, who are making an impact on the world, kind of lamenting the lack of that kind of men. He ends his sermon with a line that I think is just it's applicable for our age. So he says there, "Here is the day for the man, but where is the man for the day? Here is the day for the man, but where is the man for the day?" Okay, that being said, before getting into the books themselves, I'm looking at about 20 minutes, I suppose. So I think this shouldn't be too long on actual kind of details in the book. So I'll try to do a little bit more of a high level analysis on these. But I think it's important to lay out some of these principles before tackling it. It'll help you kind of understand what's going on in these books. Again, my goal isn't to exhaustively cover these books so that you kind of don't need to go read them, but kind of to set you up to want to go read them. My hope is that after you read this, you would go, wow, I have some handles and I'm really interested and I want to go read Leviticus. I want to go read Numbers, not, oh, great, now I can skip it. No, that's not the point. So I'll be a little bit higher level on the actual details on these ones. So that being said, kind of with that picture in view of, we need to recover a good concept of law and gospel. And before, we jump into these books, which are so heavy on law and gospel, I want to lay out for you just some a good principle or a good pattern for what it looks like to understand how the Christian should think about Old Covenant law, how the Christian should think about Old Testament law for us today, the laws of Exodus, the laws of Leviticus and Deuteronomy. How should Christians think about this? So this is a highly contested question. I'm not going to say this is a simple question or that these ample answers are simple and just kind of neat and tidy. We can be done with it. Lots of really, really respectable theologians and perspectives that you can take on this. New Covenant theology is a newer school. Progressive covenantalism is a newer take. And there's a lot to commend those perspectives. There's dispensationalism as well is another answer to that question. But I think they all have all of those kind of more modern perspectives. I just have pretty serious flaws and tend to be very, very like hard to actually do anything with. Very hard to actually go from here's this law to how do I apply that. It tends to, from what I've seen, my perspective, it seems like a lot of those answers to the question of the law for the Christian tends to more or less amount to kind of explaining away what God says in the Old Testament. And that's not as a rule true. It just seems to kind of complicate things so much that it basically leaves you empty-handed at the end of the day. So I think the best approach, I think it's by far the most helpful and clear approach, but also the most biblical. I really do think this is the most faithful to the actual biblical text. Especially of what the New Testament says about the Old Testament. I think it is the classic Reformed confessions. I think the classic Reformed confession, especially of the English-speaking 17th century, or English-speaking confessions of the 17th century, I really do think that those just have the clearest and the best articulation of how the Christian and even Christian societies should be thinking about the law of God. So I want to read a few paragraphs from the 1689 Second London Baptist Confession of Faith. So this is kind of the kind of foundational confession of faith from Reformed Baptists, from Calvinistic Baptists, out of London, obviously. Southern Baptists hugely influenced by this, especially historically. Many of our the Baptist Faith and Message 2000 kind of is an evolution of a confession of a confession of a confession of a confession that eventually works its way back to this confession. So it's a very rooted Baptist historic confession. It's really, really good, really beautiful. Lots of and a lot of what it does is it kind of takes the Westminster Confession, takes the Savoy Declaration, kind of the congregational modification on the Westminster, and basically it says, man, that's great. That's really, really good. So we're gonna take a lot of it, mostly to say, hey, we're on the same page on these things. But then we're gonna modify it where we think it falls short. Obviously, baptism itself being a key issue, but not the only issue. There's lots of stuff lots of or a good handful of tweaks that I think are helpful. But anyways, London Baptist Confession, 1689. It's good stuff. All right, so chapter 19 on the law of God, starting in paragraph 2. I want to read a little bit for you. So paragraph 1 basically just says that God wrote his law on Adam's heart. so that Adam kind of knew it intuitively and kind of was instructed by God with his law, just kind of intuitively from his creation. Paul in Romans 2 will say that basically that's still there. That's still functionally there. It's been marred. It's been corrupted by the fall, by human tradition, all those things. But that's still kind of in principle true. So it's the laws written on Adam's heart. Paragraph 2 then jumps in and says, the same law that was first written in the heart of man continued to be a perfect rule of righteousness after the fall, and was delivered by God upon Mount Sinai in the 10 Commandments, and written in 2 tables. The 4 first containing our duty towards God, and the other 6 our duty to man. So 2 tables meaning like two tablets. And on the first tablet was the first 4 commandments containing our duty towards God, and the other tablet, the other rock, contained the other 6, that was our duty to man. Again, Jesus sums this up as love the Lord your God with all your heart, love your neighbor as yourself. That's a summary, kind of a summary of the 2 tables of the law of the 10 Commandments. And again, it's not, they're not here saying that the 10 Commandments just are that law, but that law is expressed in the 10 Commandments. So again, just specifying that universal law written on Adam's heart was given to all people through Moses on Mount Sinai. So then you send to paragraph 3, as is helpful. He says, besides this law, remember the 10 Commandments, besides this law, commonly called moral. So note that. So I think that's just important to note. You're going to see here in a little bit here 3 divisions of the law: moral, ceremonial, and civil. Or I think the confession here calls it judicial, kind of legal, right? The judicial law. Anyways, moral, ceremonial, and judicial. Moral, ceremonial, and civil, right? So the moral law here just is the 10 Commandments, right? That's it, right? That's the substance of the moral law. Then everything else in the Old Testament, everything else is either civil or ceremonial, or some mixture of the 2, right? Everything else is civil or ceremonial. The moral law is just the 10 Commandments. That's really important. For some reason, critics of the Reform perspective just don't see that for some reason. So a lot of critiques of the Reformed position on the law for the Christian, it just is attacking a straw man. And I think they just don't know, because I think a lot of it happens to be like it's just this older position that it's easy to just kind of take the critiques that you've heard somebody else who's on your side, take his critiques, assume that they're all correct, and repeat them. And I think there's a lot of that where people just aren't actually going back and reading the sources, reading the confessions, and seeing what the Reformed actually say about the threefold division of the law. Anyways, that might not ever be a debate you find yourself in, but it's interesting to know. I think, anyways, it might be helpful. So then he goes on, or I guess, yeah. So besides this law, commonly called moral, God was pleased to give to the people of Israel ceremonial laws containing several typical ordinances, partly of worship, prefiguring Christ, his graces, actions, sufferings, and benefits, and partly holding forth diverse instructions of moral duties. All of which ceremonial laws, being appointed only to the time of Reformation, are, by Jesus Christ, the true Messiah and only lawgiver, who was furnished with power from the Father for that end, abrogated and taken away. That is quite the sentence. That is a run-on. I think that was all one sentence. Wow. Okay, so basically the point being, these ceremonial laws, they point us, what they do is they point us to Jesus, and they kind of flesh out some of our moral duties, or they kind of their commentary on what it means to not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, what it means to not worship idols, what it means to honor the Sabbath, or kind of flesh out those details a little bit. And so the point of that, whether they're the laws pointing to Jesus or specifying our moral duties in the first table, Jesus abrogated them. The ceremonial law is abrogated in and through Jesus Christ. So then you get to paragraph 4. So you have the moral law, the ceremonial law. Then paragraph 4 says, to them also he gave various judicial laws, which expired together with the state of that people, Israel, not obliging any now by virtue of that institution, their general equity only being of moral use. Right, so here's the third category: judicial laws, some often called civil laws. So when Israel ceased to be a nation, these laws ceased to be relevant to the believer, ceased to be relevant kind of in their specific details to the believer. But yet, take careful note of that last clause where it says their general equity only being of moral use. Right? So what does that mean? Basically, what they're saying there is that these laws, as kind of the specific statutory code, are no longer specifically binding on Christians or Christian societies, and yet they still teach us truth about God's moral law. They still teach us truth about good and godly legislation for God's covenant people, for a society of people trying to live for and with the Lord. Meaning, so what the Levitical and the Deuteronomic laws calls evil is still evil, right? But we're free to kind of structure our specific laws differently. Right, or to put it another way, right, we don't need to copy and paste these laws into the American legal code, and yet legislators should be consulting these laws as a sketch of what God calls evil and what God calls just, right? So the general equity basically means like kind of the point of these laws is still good legislation. So something like there's laws in there about who is responsible and who needs to pay what based on, if your ox gores somebody, stabs somebody, is that the first time he's gored? Well, then there's one penalty, you didn't see that coming, but you are still responsible to pay for his medical bills, whatever. But if it's like the second time that bull has gored somebody, like if that's a goring bull, that bull likes to stab, then that's actually a bigger penalty, and now you're on the hook for manslaughter, right? It's much bigger, right? And so kind of that idea of like, okay, there's a certain measure of what it means to not take life unjustly applies to, what do I do with my bull? And even for those of us that don't have bulls, it still raises the question of, well, what do I do with my, construction equipment, right? What do I do with my heavy machinery? What do I do with my vehicles, right? So there's the general equity, that principle of like, hey, what your bull does is your responsibility, and you need to be thoughtful about how that's impacting other people. The kind of the spirit of that law is still valid, that legislators should be thinking about. That's kind of the thrust of it. That's the classic reform position, the classic, probably even just the Protestant position. Luther says pretty similar things in some of his works. So, anyways, that's just kind of jumping into these laws. So what you need to be thinking is not like, there's a bunch of weird laws that aren't relevant to me at all. But neither should you be thinking, oh man, I need to be doing all of these things. These are specific things that I need to be doing. No, the Christian perspective is something somewhat in the middle. The general equity of these laws is still meaningful to you. Basically these laws still teach you something, even though the specific code is no longer binding, being abrogated through Christ. Okay, that's quite the intro. So let's go ahead and jump into Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Yeah, look at my notes. I do plan to be fairly high level on this, so it shouldn't end up being too crazy long. But who knows? I've been known to go a little bit longer than I imagine sometimes. Okay. Structure of Leviticus. So I'll go through. I'll still go in the same order. So I'll do structure of Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Then I'll do redemption of Leviticus, Numbers. Or I guess theology of Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Redemption, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Application. Right. Just that was kind of how that worked out in my notes. So I'll just kind of do it that way. Anyway. So Leviticus. A good kind of tagline for Leviticus would be from chapter 19, verse 2. You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Leviticus is basically a manual, or a set of manuals on what it looks like for Israel as the covenant people of God to be a holy nation. So first, basically it's broken up into several different kind of manuals for various aspects of living with God. Chapters 1 through 7, you could call. I'm getting a lot of this again from Grisanti. I think it's Michael Grisanti from the World and the Word. He was really helpful for a lot of these Pentateuch books. And then some other books as well in here. But so he breaks out these divisions this way. So chapters 1 through 7 is the Leviticus. You see a manual of sacrifice, right? Basically, what it means to enjoy God's presence. And so again, as these ceremonial laws point towards Christ, this manual of sacrifice for the Christian should really first and foremost be reminding us of the sacrifice of Christ for our perpetual living before the Lord. So chapters 1 through 7, manual of sacrifice. Chapters 8 through 10 is a manual of the priesthood, what it looks like to enter God's service, the clothing for the priests, how to be ordained as a priest, all those things. Then manual of purity, kind of what it looks like to just do life as one of God's creatures. This is 11 through 15. Looks at ceremonies and practices for holiness concerning daily food, concerning childbirth, concerning diseases, and just kind of bodily processes. And so there's just this picture of what it looked like to live a holy life with regard to these just mundane human activities. Then you get the manual of atonement. So this is kind of the big sacrifice, the big once a year sacrifice of forgiveness. That's chapter 16. You see the Day of Atonement. spelled out there. Then a manual for holiness, basically enacting God's word, is chapters 17 through 26. So kind of, again, just kind of daily life, worship calendar, kind of national festivals get spelled out. This is where you get what I quoted earlier, you shall be holy for the Lord your God, I'm holy. But then also chapter 19, verse 18, where we see you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I'm the Lord, right? So we see just these roots of New Testament principles being sown or being digging down in the Old Testament itself. Then last, we see the manual of dedication in chapter 27, basically what it looks like just to dedicate this nation, this tabernacle, into or to the Lord. So that's Leviticus. Just a series of basically manuals for kind of different areas of life. And that's that form that I was talking about. This is giving form and structure to what it looks like to live out the substance of gospel life. Again, the details aren't binding on us, but the principles still are. The principles are there to teach us about what it looks like to be one of God's creatures, especially among God's covenant people. So then Numbers, structure of Numbers is a little bit more simple. Basically, there's two big sections and kind of a little intermediate, kind of a seam section in the middle. The first section is chapter 1 through 21, basically the old generation. The big kind of arc of Numbers, there's one generation that is unfaithful to the Lord, that gets judged and that dies in the desert. And then there's a second generation that rises up that is faithful, that believes, that obeys, that is faithful, and then it prepares to enter into the promised land. So chapters 1 through 2, the reason it's called Numbers is you see two big censuses, two big countings of the people. The first one is chapters 1 and 2 is the first sentence. 3 through 10 is basically the people preparing to go to Sinai to take the journey to the mountain. 11 through 19, you see basically a kind of a steady slide into rebellion. And this is where you see the big rebellion here is chapter 14, where the people refuse to enter the promised land, right? They get up to the edge of Jordan and they send in some spies to go check out the land. And they come back and they basically say, hey, the land is beautiful. It's wonderful. But there's some pretty powerful nations there. I'm pretty sure they even have giants. Like this doesn't look great. Wonderful land. Going to be some hard fighting. I don't know if we can do it. And the people basically say, yeah, we probably can't. We're not even going to try. Let's just go back. Like God probably brought us here just to kill us. So let's not do that. They don't trust the Lord, right? They just saw God crush the mightiest empire in the world without even their intervention, and now they're afraid to go and engage these nations in battle. And so this lack of faith is kind of the key moment of their judgment. Is the key moment of their lack of faith, their lack of obedience, leading to their judgment. And the Lord promises that all of them, that generation, everyone, I think it was 20 years and older, other than like the two faithful spies, Joshua and Caleb. God says that they will not enter the promised land, but they're going to die in the desert, and their children will enter in the promised land instead of them. So it's an unfaithful generation, and this section ends with the death of Miriam and Aaron, who are leaders in Israel, and Moses' sister and brother, respectively. And there's some high points and some low points. It's not kind of a monolithic dark. It's like the backside isn't monolithic light. There's some highs and lows in both of them, but the trend is down in the first section and up in the second section. So then you get this middle point, this middle section in the middle, chapters 22 and 24, where you see this weird interaction between Balaam and Balak. Balaam is basically a prophet for hire. It's interesting because he's not a like prophet of the Lord. He's not a God-fearing prophet. He seems to be basically like a witch doctor. Something like that, something to that effect. Kind of a soothsayer, an astrologer or whatever, who hires out his services to give prophecies to the highest bidder and all that. And so Balak is the king of the Moabites, pretty sure. So Balak is the king of the local nation. And basically Balak tries to hire Balaam to curse Israel. He just says, all right, Balaam, I just want you to call down a curse on this nation so that we can defeat them in battle. And Balaam basically says, like, you know what, I'm gonna do what you asked me to do, but I can only do give you the words that the Lord puts into my mouth. And so he kind of like, it's weird. He kind of like goes to try to curse Israel, but I think it's 3 or 4 times. All he can do is bless them. All he can do is just give these prophecies about the glorious future of the world that God is going to work through Israel. And interestingly, even, rising to the point of predicting this star, this king who's going to rise out of Israel. He has this line where it's something to the effect of like, he was near, but not yet. He's close, but not here. It's just this really sweet prophecy of, yeah, the coming of Christ, the coming of the one who's going to rule the nations for the blessings, the glory of God, and the good of all peoples. What's so interesting here, what I think is important, is where this sits is right after just the wild unfaithfulness of the older generation. Have just been completely unfaithful to the Lord, did not trust Him, did not obey Him, did not believe in Him, feared man more than they feared God, and yet God's covenant promises are still true. God's covenant promises are still absolutely certain. So this should just be a helpful reminder for us. Again, especially in a season like ours, where we're kind of looking around or wondering, man, what are the forms of gospel structure that we need to rebuild over the next couple of generations? What is that going to look like? How can we possibly have a thriving future in this nation or any other nation? How can God's purposes still possibly work in and through our generation and the coming generations? This little section reminds us that that's just totally the wrong thing to be looking at. We shouldn't be looking at the news. We shouldn't be looking at, Barna reports. We shouldn't be looking at Pew reports and going, oh, here's what's the future of the church holds. No, that's ridiculous. The future of the church is told to us in the Bible. The future of the church is told to us that the government shall be on his shoulders, Isaiah 6? No, 9, Isaiah 9. The government shall be on his shoulders, says Christ the Lord. The government shall be on his shoulders, and of the increase of his government and of peace there shall be no end. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven that fills, that works its way into the whole lump, that through the line of Abraham, all the families of the earth will be blessed, that Christ has authority over all nations. And so we are making disciples of all nations. That Christ is not going to be defeated by world philosophies and world power. So we don't look at the news. We don't look at the faithfulness or unfaithfulness of our generation and wonder, how is God possibly going to do something through us? No, God is still working His promises. God is still going to be faithful to do the things He promised to do. Our hope for the success of God's kingdom in the world should not be based on what we observe around us, but what Jesus Christ has told us. He is building His church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. He is building His church. So Numbers then ends with that last section, 25 through 36. This is the new generation, that second generation. There's another census, and basically you see the numbers. They're very close to each other. The great masses that were brought out of Egypt have been replaced by this new generation. And you see Joshua gets appointed to replace Moses. He gets kind of the tap on the shoulder of coming leadership, and then kind of the nation in 28 through 36 basically just gets prepared and set up to enter the land, to cross the river and enter the land, which sets us up with Deuteronomy. The book of Deuteronomy, again, this is basically, you can think of it almost as like a series of sermons from Moses, structured intentionally, fit together very intentionally. So chapters 1 through 4 is basically kind of a historical review of how God has redeemed the promises He made and how He has redeemed His people. Chapters 5 through 26, that's kind of the bulk of it, is basically the covenant and law. It's kind of, again, a recapitulation of God's covenant with His people, how they're going to live with Him and for Him and under Him and through Him in the promised land. And then 27 and 28, it's a really striking section, basically just curses for disobedience and blessings for obedience. Curses for, if you don't live according to my law, here's all the bad things that are going to happen. If you do live according to my law, here's the blessings I'm going to pour out on you. So these are fascinating and just a helpful picture of what God has in mind for these people. Ultimately, this leads into chapters 29 and 30, which is basically warning and promises and prophecies of, all right, one day, kind of like I said earlier, there's going to be a long stretch of faithfulness, and you're going to be blessed, and we see that unfold under David. But then there's going to be a slow decline into apostasy. And in that day, you're going to be taken away. You're going to eventually be judged and sent into exile. But then when I hear the cry of my people, I'm going to save them. Again, I'm going to bring them out of exile, bring them back into the land. And that's where you get and once I bring you back into the land, then I'm going to circumcise your heart. I'm going to actually change your heart and write the law on your heart. Which again is kind of one of the earlier kind of new covenant, new heart promises that we start to see throughout the scriptures. That theme, again, back to our kind of fugue, adding layer after layer after layer, this is kind of where you start to see that I'm going to give you a new heart theme start to get developed. It gets greatly expanded in the prophets, especially in Ezekiel, and then into the minor prophets a little bit as well. This promise of a new heart that then Jesus picks up on in John 3. You must be born again if you're going to see the kingdom. It's not just look at Jesus, kind of make some rational decisions and obey Him. There's actually a spiritual regeneration that's required to see and recognize and love and know Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. Jesus picks us up again, John 6, where he says, no one can come to me. No one's going to come to me. No one's going to believe me. No one's going to follow me. No one's going to receive me as Lord and Savior. No one comes to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. So unless the Father does a work in your heart first, you're never going to see and believe in Jesus Christ. So that's 29 and 30. Then 31 through 34 is kind of the narrative epilogue. You see Moses' song, which is it's great, but it's kind of mostly judgment. It tends towards judgment on the coming unfaithfulness of the people, which even just kind of sets up this kind of pessimistic tone for fallen man without renewed hearts. Just aren't going to, over the long run, actually keep God's law, actually keep the law that God has given them. So Moses, chapter 33, Moses' blessing for the tribes, and then chapter 34, Moses dies, and Joshua takes the lead of the nation. So that's the basic structure of these three books. Theology, I'll be brief here. So theology of Leviticus basically is just that God is holy, and we need to be cleansed from our sin in every category to live with him. Numbers, the big theology point is that God will fulfill his purposes in the world, but we are still held accountable and responsible for our actions. God's promises don't exclude us from his discipline, right? God's promises, God's covenant promises aren't excuses for laziness, aren't excuses for presumption. We're still called to live and obey in faith. Okay, then Deuteronomy, basically, what I would kind of add to that is just this idea that righteousness is a matter of the heart. It's not just about kind of doing the letter of the law, but actually being renewed from the heart to gladly obey God and his covenant requirements. So in redemption, Leviticus basically just the idea is that dwelling with a holy God will require blood atonement for sin. We see this in the sacrificial system. We see this especially in the Day of Atonement, and what it takes to ordain the priesthood and all the sacrifices that are required. We just see this all over the place in Leviticus that living with God requires blood cleansing from our sin. All these animals point to it, but it's not actually accomplished until Jesus Christ himself comes and bleeds on the cross for us. So redemption, again, Numbers, basically in spite of our faithlessness and failures, God will fulfill his promises because he does not change. Numbers 23:19 is right in that big kind of hinge section, just says, God is not man that he should lie, or a son of man that he should change his mind. Has he said and will he not do it? Or has he spoken and will he not fulfill it, right? So the big thrust of Numbers is just that. God is faithful because he does not change. In spite of our faithlessness, even as we are disciplined or even punished for our faithlessness, for our disobedience, for our backsliding, even as we're disciplined, God does not change, and God is still faithful to his promises. And then ultimately, he's going to raise up a king from Israel, which is in Numbers 24:17, that God is going to raise up a king through whom he's going to bring about this global blessing. So redemption, again, Deuteronomy. Basically, we see here, it's one note to note here, another kind of one of those layers that starts to get brought to the surface in Deuteronomy is just this anticipation of a prophet like Moses. A prophet who is like Moses, who will bring about a new covenant. So this comes out in Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 15 through 19, where Moses says, in that day, there's going to be a prophet like me who's going to come from among you. When he comes, listen to him. When he comes, listen to him. God's going to put his words in his mouth, so you listen to him. We see this, I think we see this fulfilled in the Transfiguration. We see this Matthew 17:1 through 5 is where you can see this, where Jesus and Moses and even Elijah are on this mountain, and a couple of the disciples are there witnessing it. And all three of those men are there, Jesus, Elijah, and Moses. And a cloud of glory descends on them, and a voice from the cloud says, "This, Jesus, is my beloved son. Listen to him." Basically saying, this is the one that Moses was talking about. He has come now, so now listen to him. His word now supersedes Moses. His covenant now supersedes Moses. Okay, so that's kind of the redemptive themes in these three books. Last, just a quick note on application. So there's a big idea, really, in all of these, but a big idea in Leviticus is just the call to trust in Christ as both our priest and our sacrifice. He is both the priest, kind of the one who affects the agent who brings us to reconciliation with God, but he's also the sacrifice itself. So Leviticus should just cause us to reflect on just the incredible grace and sacrifice that is the work of Christ on the cross for us. The Numbers, basically, this is a call to pursue holiness and to pursue obedience. Even saying that sin has generational consequences. The sin of that older generation led to their children spending the first 20 years, or I guess 40 years of their life wandering around in the desert. not a great inheritance to pass on to the children. So pursue holiness, pursue obedience. Again, not to earn God's salvation. They've already been brought out of Egypt, but out of, because of what God has done, because of the salvation that God has done for you in Jesus Christ. Pursue holiness, pursue obedience, pursue the form because you've been given the substance. And Deuteronomy, one of the common themes, especially in chapters 30, after it lays out the covenant, lays out the blessings and curses, then Deuteronomy 30 hits this theme of I've given you two paths. There's a path of life, there's a path of death. Choose the path of life. The Psalms pick up on this theme pretty heavily, just saying that these two ways. There's the wise man that meditates on the law, and there's the fools that meditate on wickedness. Choose the path of life. Right? So that's kind of the aspect of Deuteronomy, that there's a law, there's a way that God has laid out for you to live your life. So choose the path of life. You have been bought from death into life by the blood of Christ, purchased for you, given to you on the cross, confirmed in the resurrection, given power in the Holy Spirit through the resurrection, so that you can walk the path of life. You, Christian, your heart has been circumcised. You have been changed, that you can love the Lord your God with all your heart. So choose the path of life. Okay. That is all I have to say about these three books. Yeah, these are tremendously important books. I think taken as a whole, I think they do work well together. So I think it's helpful to consider them together. Again, I hope you would just take these as handles, as rails to go and jump into these books. Man, these books are rich. They are long, and there is a lot of detail. I just give one encouragement for reading through them. I would encourage you to read them in bigger chunks. I wouldn't recommend reading kind of one chapter at a time. I think a lot of these three books, especially, they have big story arcs and they have big blocks of text that I would recommend, if you can find the time, if you can do it, read it in 5 to 10 chapters at a time. I think that's going to actually help you read it kind of at the cruising altitude. That's going to be the most helpful to actually understand what's going on and actually gain something from it. Something like the Book of Proverbs, you should read 3 or 4 verses at a time. Right, you should read that slowly and kind of chew on each of it. Book of Romans, you probably could do maybe half a chapter, maybe a chapter, right? That's a good kind of pace to just chew on the details, what's going on there. Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, man, you got to read these at a high level. You got to read 5, 10 chapters at a time to see the big arc of the story of what's going on. So that's one encouragement I would give you, is instead of trying to read, one chapter a day over a month to get through them, try to set aside, pick a Saturday, take an hour and read 10 chapters, 2 or 3 times to get through them. That might be the most helpful way for you to actually engage these texts kind of as they are. Anyways, okay, that is all I have to say about these 3 books. Hopefully this is helpful. Hopefully this has been interesting to you. I hope this just helps you again to just long for a day, even in our day, when God would raise up good and godly form. That we would grow as a church broadly, that we would grow as people who appreciate, understand just the biblical relationship of law and gospel, that God's gospel doesn't save us from the law, but actually saves us so we might delight in the law. It would be freed from the penalty of the law, freed from the consequences of sin and death from the law. Absolutely. Yes and amen. But we're freed to actually live lives delighting to obey God in and through his law. Okay. I hope you would find much wisdom in reading these books, that the Lord would open your eyes to cherish his word, love his word, and walk according to his word. May God bless you.